Based on research in India and Mexico, Cole and Hoover argued that rapid population growth was a primary cause of the chronic poverty and the low economic growth rates of both countries, and that strenuous efforts to lower fertility rates were a precondition of economic development. This view quickly gained favor among much of the political leadership in the West, as well as political elites in many parts of the developing world, particularly Asia. The population crisis consensus, as it might be called, was not restricted to concern about economic development. Although rarely articulated, many of its adherents also worried about the threat they perceived population growth to pose to international stability and national security. As today, there were concerns about population pressure giving rise to unmanageable international migration and to threats to various natural systems, to food security, and to the environment. The consensus, while an accurate depiction, I think, of Western views, was by no means shared by countries on the other side of the Iron Curtain, nor by those in the developing world who followed the teachings of Marx and Engels. Indeed, throughout the 60s and the 70s, it was impossible to achieve consensus within the United Nations on the priority that population policies and programs should receive. Yet a major industry was established beginning in the 1950s and continuing through the 60s, comprised initially of think tanks like the Population Council and international NGOs like IPPF, then bilateral development agencies led by Swedish SIDA and USAID, and eventually the multilaterals, UNFPA and the World Bank. A consensus that spent hundreds of millions of dollars annually to promote population policies and to support family planning programs throughout the developing world. The Netherlands was part of that consensus, although not among the original leaders of the advocacy effort. International population conferences began to be convened in the 1950s in Tehran, 1960s in Rome, culminating in the series of 3 UN-sponsored global political meetings that ran from Bucharest through Mexico City to Cairo. In the decade between the Bucharest Conference in 1974 and the Mexico City Conference in 1984, I think something like a consensus emerged on the urgency of the population problem on a worldwide basis, and the appropriateness of the family planning program response to that problem, or crisis, as it was usually seen. But I would argue that the global population crisis consensus began to disintegrate in the mid-1980s as the result of 2 major interrelated factors. First, the administration of President Ronald Reagan in the United States reversed decades-old US policy and declared in 1984 at the Mexico City International Conference on Population that it no longer considered population growth to be a negative factor in development, signaling in turn a serious downgrading of the priority to be given to population program assistance. Given that the US was for many years the principal driver of the population crisis consensus and the main funder of the movement it inspired, this was a major blow. Second, we began to see by the mid and late 1980s significant declines in population growth rates in every major region of the world except sub-Saharan Africa. If there ever had been a case for a crisis mentality, many people began to feel by the end of the 80s that it had passed. Certainly in many of the countries that first responded to the crisis by mounting aggressive population policies, Korea, Thailand, Indonesia, Tunisia, Colombia, and Mexico, for example, fertility rates had fallen to near replacement levels. Others that started their program somewhat later, among others Bangladesh, Egypt, China, Morocco, Kenya, Zimbabwe, Iran, and Vietnam, were also showing major fertility declines. Fertility declines over the second half of the 20th century, whether primarily due to strong policies and programs or to more natural responses to improving living standards. And of course, in most cases, they were due to both. Were clearly enough established throughout Asia, the Middle East, and Central and South America that crisis no longer seemed like the right framework to think about population issues by the time the Cairo conference was approaching. It's no wonder then that in the ensuing political struggle between demographers and reproductive rights advocates at Cairo, the latter emerged victorious. The demographers simply had a less compelling case. For 3 decades, political leaders to a greater or lesser degree had been willing to accord a lower priority to the protection of reproductive rights than to a sense of demographic urgency, often explicitly recognizing that they were making such a trade-off and explaining it as a lesser evil. By the time of Cairo, few, if any, any longer found it possible to sustain such a position. The years since Cairo have been very difficult ones for the erstwhile population movement. I use this term advisedly because, in fact, while a version of that movement still exists, it can no longer be called by that name. The famous paradigm shift of Cairo so thoroughly changed the rules of the game, as well as the shape of the arena, that we are now compelled to refer to the movement in terms of sexual and reproductive health and rights, which you must admit is quite a mouthful. What had 20 years earlier been an international movement to promote a particular set of policies and programs to reduce population growth became, after 1994, a movement to promote reproductive and later sexual health and rights as ends in themselves. I don't pass judgment on this major shift in the movement's goals and content. I see it as the natural consequence of a series of changes in the global environment, some of them political, some demographic, others social and cultural. What I will say, however, is that the virtual disappearance of the demographic rationale took with it the very strong sense of urgency, even imperative to action, that the population crisis mentality inspired. I state this as a fact, not as a lament. Whether one thinks of rapid population growth as ever having been a global threat, or whether one rejoices in the shift to a rights-based approach, I think we all must recognize that the change that occurred at Cairo resulted in a much lower priority for reproductive and sexual health programs than their more narrowly defined family planning predecessors enjoyed. Since the high water mark in the year following Cairo, 1995, funding for population activities as defined in the Cairo Program of Action has fallen considerably. Funding for family planning, I estimate, has fallen by some 30%. There are several reasons for this beyond the 2 major factors I mentioned earlier: the US policy shift and the fall in fertility in much of the world. Additional factors would include the following. First, changing priorities in the health sector, including, of course, the HIV/AIDS pandemic. Second, the failure to include any reference to the Cairo goals in the Millennium Development Goals, itself a reflection of the lower sense of urgency that I've been describing. Third, the changing architecture of international development cooperation, with its strong emphasis on budget and sector support and country ownership, a recognition that the population crisis consensus was always more strongly felt by donors than by the recipients of aid. And finally, confusion and to some degree controversy surrounding the term sexual and reproductive health and rights. As a consequence of these multiple and somewhat interrelated factors, the simple truth is that in many countries today, individuals, women in particular, have less help and less power to exercise control over their own reproduction and their reproductive health than they did a decade ago. The decline in funding, in other words, is making a mockery of the Cairo commitment to universal access to reproductive health. Now, having tried to remain objective and descriptive in my historical overview, permit me to become a bit more normative and prescriptive in my remaining comments. I think that the retreat that I've just described is a bad thing. and highly regrettable. And I think